There's a secret your brain keeps from you every morning when you wake up. It remembers every moment you abandoned yourself, every time you chose the familiar prison over the unknown freedom, every whisper from your soul that you translated into the safer language of logic. The modern mind lives in exile from itself, hyper-connected to information, disconnected from wisdom. We've built cathedrals of knowledge while our inner sanctuary crumbles in silence. But here's what neuroscience hasn't dared to admit yet. Your brain doesn't just process reality. It creates it from the fragments of who you believe yourself to be. She sat in her car after another exhausting day, scrolling through her phone, consuming content that promised to fix her life in 10 easy steps. Her brain fired rapidly. Dopamine, notifications, the endless ping of modern existence. Yet something ancient within her felt starved, like a wolf that had forgotten how to hunt. This is the modern paradox. We live in an age of infinite information, yet profound disconnection from our own inner knowing. Carl Jung called it the neurosis of our time, when the ego becomes so loud that it drowns out the soul's quieter language. Your brain processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second, but consciously perceives only about 40. What determines which 40 bits reach your awareness? The story you've been telling yourself about who you are, and more importantly, who you're not allowed to be. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio discovered that patients with damage to the emotional centers of their brains couldn't make decisions, even simple ones. Logic alone was paralyzed without feeling, yet we've been taught to live as if emotions were inconvenient interruptions to rational thought. What if I told you that every moment of self-abandonment creates a neural pathway of disconnection? That every time you silence your inner voice, you're literally rewiring your brain to forget who you are? In a laboratory in Switzerland, researchers hooked participants up to brain imaging equipment and asked them to remember painful childhood experiences. The scans showed activation not just in memory centers, but in the same regions that process physical pain. The brain, it turns out, doesn't distinguish between emotional and physical wounds. Both leave scars in neural tissue. But here's what the researchers didn't measure: the moment when a participant suddenly understood that their childhood abandonment wasn't about their worth, but about their caregiver's own unhealed wounds. In that instant of symbolic understanding, different networks lit up, areas associated with meaning-making, integration, and what neuroscientists cautiously call self-transcendence. The brain has a secret. It speaks in symbols before it speaks in words. Your dreams, your body's tensions, your inexplicable attractions and aversions, these are not random neural firing. They're a sophisticated language system that predates rational thought by millions of years. When Maria, a 34-year-old architect, finally understood that her compulsive need to control every detail in her projects was her nervous system's attempt to create the safety she never felt as a child, something shifted. Her brain scans, taken months later, showed increased connectivity between her prefrontal cortex and limbic system. The bridge between thinking and feeling had been rebuilt. The symbolic understanding didn't just give her insight, it literally rewired her neural networks. There's a reason why the most profound transformations often feel like remembering rather than learning something new. Your brain is constantly editing your experience to match your existing beliefs about yourself and the world. Neuroscientists call this confirmation bias, but ancient wisdom traditions knew it as the veil of Maya, the illusion that keeps you from seeing your true nature. Every act of authentic self-expression creates what researchers term eudaimonic neural activation, brain patterns associated with meaning, purpose, and well-being that are completely different from hedonic pleasure. When you align with your deeper truth, your brain doesn't just feel better, it functions better. The default mode network, the brain's background narrator that's constantly spinning stories about who you are, begins to quiet when you engage in practices of genuine self-inquiry. This isn't meditation. This is rebellion against the false self that your brain has been trained to maintain. But here's the paradox. To change your brain, you must first be willing to let your current sense of self die. And that feels terrifying to a nervous system designed for survival, not transformation. What if the very resistance you feel to knowing yourself is actually your soul trying to break free from the prison your mind built to keep you safe? But there's something else your brain doesn't want you to know about memory. It's not a recording. It's a living, breathing story that rewrites itself every time you remember. And hidden within those rewrites are the fragments of yourself you've been too afraid to claim. David couldn't explain why certain words made his chest tighten, why specific tones of voice sent him into a spiral of shame that seemed to have no beginning and no end. He'd learned to manage it, to breathe through it, to rationalize it away, but his body kept the score in a language his mind couldn't translate. What David's therapists couldn't see was happening in his brain. Every time someone spoke to him with even a hint of disappointment, his amygdala fired the same pattern it had learned when he was 7 years old, standing in his father's shadow, absorbing the unspoken message that he was somehow fundamentally flawed. This is trauma's secret. It's not just about what happened to you. It's about what your nervous system concluded about who you are because of what happened to you. And those conclusions get encoded not just as memories, but as neural highways that your brain travels automatically, without conscious permission. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research revealed that traumatic memories are stored differently than normal memories. They bypass the language centers of the brain and lodge directly in the body's sensory and emotional networks. This is why trauma speaks in symptoms rather than stories. The tension in your shoulders, the knot in your stomach, the way you hold your breath when someone gets too close. But here's what mainstream trauma therapy often misses. These somatic memories aren't just wounds to be healed. They're also wisdom to be decoded. Your body remembers not just the pain, but also the part of you that survived it, the part that adapted, that found ways to stay alive when staying alive felt impossible. The neural pathways of trauma are also pathways of resilience. But to access that resilience, you must be willing to listen to what your body has been trying to tell you in its own ancient language. She could still taste the fear from 30 years ago, metallic, sharp, like copper pennies dissolved in her mouth. It happened every time she had to speak in public, even though her conscious mind knew she was safe, successful, competent. But emotional memory operates by different rules than rational memory. Emotional memories are encoded by the limbic system through a cocktail of stress hormones and neurotransmitters that create what neuroscientist Lynn Nadel calls flashbulb memories, moments burned into neural tissue with chemical intensity. These memories don't fade with time. They fossilize, becoming more real to your nervous system than present moment reality. What makes emotional memories particularly powerful is that they carry not just the facts of what happened, but the meaning you made of what happened. And often, that meaning was created by the youngest, most vulnerable part of you, the part that concluded you were unlovable, unsafe, or fundamentally wrong. This is where shadow work meets neuroscience. Carl Jung understood that the shadow, those parts of ourselves we've rejected or denied, doesn't disappear. It goes underground, shaping our perceptions and reactions from the unconscious depths. Modern neuroscience has discovered that these unconscious patterns literally live in our neural networks, firing automatically below the threshold of awareness. Every time you react disproportionately to a situation, every time you feel an emotion that seems too big for the moment, you're encountering a shadow memory, an emotional imprint that's trying to complete an interrupted story from your past. But here's the revolutionary insight. When you can meet these shadow memories with curiosity instead of judgment, when you can listen to what they're trying to tell you about the parts of yourself you had to hide to survive, they begin to transform from wounds into wisdom. The brain's ability to change throughout life, neuroplasticity, was supposed to be neuroscience's great hope. If the brain could rewire itself, then surely we could think our way out of any pattern, meditate our way to peace, or visualize our way to a better life. But what researchers didn't anticipate was this. The brain will only change in service of what it perceives as authentic. You can't think your way into being someone you're not. You can't meditate away parts of yourself that are genuinely trying to emerge. And you can't visualize a future that contradicts the core truth of who you are. Thomas had spent years in therapy, trying to become more outgoing, more confident, more like the person he thought he should be. He practiced positive affirmations, attended networking events, pushed himself into social situations that drained his soul. His brain remained stubbornly unchanged, clinging to what therapists labeled as social anxiety, but what was actually his nervous system's way of protecting his naturally contemplative, introspective nature. It wasn't until Thomas began to honor his need for solitude, to see his sensitivity as a gift rather than a flaw, that his brain began to change, not to make him someone different, but to make him more authentically himself. This is neuroplasticity's secret. The brain doesn't just adapt to new behaviors, it reorganizes itself in response to congruence, those moments when your actions align with your deepest truth, when your outer life begins to match your inner nature. Richard Davidson's research on long-term meditators showed that their brains didn't just become calmer, they became more integrated, with increased communication between the rational prefrontal cortex and the emotional limbic system. But the most profound changes occurred in those who meditated not to escape themselves, but to meet themselves more fully. The brain, it turns out, is designed for authenticity. Every time you act from your genuine nature, rather than from who you think you should be, you create new neural pathways of self-trust. Every time you honor your authentic responses, rather than performing expected ones, you strengthen the neural networks of integrity. But what happens when the very act of being authentic feels like death to the parts of you that learned safety through hiding? This is where we enter the forbidden territory of neuroscience, the place where science meets the soul's darkest truths. Your brain doesn't just store memories, it becomes the architecture of everything you've refused to acknowledge about yourself. Rachel noticed it first in mirrors. Not her reflection, but what was missing from it. She looked successful, composed, everything her LinkedIn profile promised, but there was an absence behind her eyes, a hollowness that no amount of achievement could fill. What she couldn't see was how her brain had spent decades building neural highways around that emptiness, creating elaborate detours to avoid the grief she'd never allowed herself to feel. The unconscious doesn't sleep. While your conscious mind plans and analyzes and problem solves, your unconscious is constantly reshaping your neural landscape based on one primary directive: avoid at all costs the parts of yourself that once felt too dangerous to feel. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on emotional construction reveals that your brain doesn't simply react to emotions, it actively constructs them based on prediction patterns learned from past experience. But here's what she couldn't measure. Those prediction patterns are built not just from what you remember, but from what you've forgotten on purpose. Every time you suppress anger to keep peace, every time you swallow grief to appear strong, every time you bury your authentic response to preserve connection, your brain learns to predict safety through disconnection from yourself. These patterns become so automatic that you forget you're choosing them. The shadow, those disowned parts of yourself, doesn't disappear when you refuse to acknowledge it. It becomes the invisible hand that guides your neural architecture, creating blind spots in perception, gaps in emotional range, and automatic responses that serve the false self while starving the true one. In her 50s, Rachel finally understood why she felt exhausted after every success. Her brain had learned to seek achievement as a way to avoid the terror of being seen as the grief-stricken child she once was. Her neural networks had become a masterpiece of avoidance so sophisticated that she'd forgotten what she was avoiding. The stress hormone cortisol has a secret agenda. Beyond its well-known role in fight-or-flight responses, chronic cortisol actually reshapes brain structure, shrinking the hippocampus responsible for memory and learning while enlarging the amygdala that processes fear and threat. But here's what stress researchers rarely discuss. Some of the most damaging cortisol doesn't come from external threats. It comes from the internal warfare between who you are and who you think you need to be to survive. Marcus felt it every Sunday night, a dread that settled into his bones like poison. He had a good job, a stable relationship, a life that looked enviable from the outside. But every week, as Monday approached, his nervous system flooded with stress chemicals that had nothing to do with his actual work, and everything to do with the daily betrayal of pretending to be someone he wasn't. This is self-sabotage at the neural level, when living inauthentically becomes so chronic that your brain begins to perceive your own life as a threat. The cortisol released during these internal conflicts doesn't just make you feel stressed. It literally alters your perception of reality, making you more likely to notice problems, threats, and reasons why your authentic desires are dangerous or impossible. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on chronic stress shows that prolonged cortisol exposure can actually change the brain's default setting from curious exploration to suspicious vigilance. When you're in chronic conflict with yourself, your brain begins to perceive the world through a filter of threat, making authentic self-expression feel like emotional suicide. The tragic irony is that the very mechanism designed to protect you from danger becomes the thing that keeps you trapped in patterns that slowly kill your soul. Your brain, flooded with stress chemicals from internal dishonesty, begins to believe that authenticity itself is the enemy. There's a moment in every deep conversation when you can see it happen, the exact instant when someone's nervous system decides they've gotten too close to their own truth. Their eyes subtly shift, their breathing changes, and they unconsciously redirect the conversation towards safer territory. This isn't weakness. This is a highly sophisticated neural protection system that learned, often very early, that certain parts of yourself were too dangerous to reveal, even to yourself. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains how our autonomic nervous system constantly scans for safety, but what it often can't distinguish is the difference between external danger and the perceived threat of being fully yourself. When authenticity was punished in your formative years, your vagus nerve learned to associate self-expression with life-threatening danger. Eleanor discovered this when she tried to write her first novel. Every time she sat down to access her genuine creative voice, her nervous system would flood with panic. Not the kind of panic that comes from external threat, but the deeper terror of being seen in her full creative power, something that had been shamed out of her in childhood by parents who needed her to be practical, not passionate. Her brain had learned to equate artistic expression with abandonment, creativity with chaos, authenticity with annihilation. So every time she approached her own creative depths, her neural protection systems would activate elaborate escape routes, suddenly needing to clean the house, check emails, anything to pull her away from the terrifying intimacy of meeting herself on the page. This is how the shadow shapes neural patterns, not through dramatic trauma, but through 1,000 small moments when your authentic expression was met with rejection, judgment, or withdrawal of love. Your brain, designed for connection above all else, learned that survival meant cutting off the parts of you that threatened belonging. But here's the deeper truth that neuroscience is only beginning to understand. These protection patterns, while once necessary for survival, eventually become prisons that keep you from the very connections and expressions your soul most craves. The neural pathways that once saved your life can become the very things that prevent you from living it. And yet, within every pattern of self-abandonment lies an encoded memory of what you were protecting, the most precious parts of yourself that were too valuable to risk losing. Here's where neuroscience stumbles into ancient wisdom, and discovers that the brain has been waiting millennia for you to remember who you really are. The archetypes aren't just poetic metaphors, they're activation codes for neural networks that have been sleeping in your DNA since before you learned to speak. When Janet first heard the story of Persephone descending into the underworld, something stirred in her brain that felt older than memory. Not the intellectual recognition of a myth, but a cellular awakening, as if circuits that had been dark for decades suddenly hummed to life. She had been living what she called the beige life: safe job, predictable routine, careful choices that never risked too much joy or too much pain. But the image of Persephone voluntarily eating the pomegranate seeds, choosing to spend half her life in darkness to claim her power as queen of the underworld, lit up neural pathways Janet didn't know she possessed. This is the secret power of archetypal symbols. They bypass the rational mind and speak directly to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, neural patterns shared across humanity that carry blueprints for wholeness, transformation, and authentic power. Modern neuroscience is discovering what shamans have known for thousands of years. Certain images, stories, and symbols can activate dormant neural networks almost instantaneously. Dr. Jordan Peterson's research on archetypal narratives shows that mythological stories trigger complex patterns of brain activation that include regions associated with personal meaning, emotional regulation, and what researchers cautiously term self-transcendence. But it's not just any symbol that creates this neural awakening. It's the symbol that matches your soul's unique blueprint, the archetypal pattern that represents the specific aspect of wholeness you've been unconsciously seeking. When Janet encountered Persephone, her brain didn't just process a story, it recognized a homecoming. The myth activated neural pathways connected to her own journey into the darkness of depression, her own choice to descend into her psychological underworld rather than remaining in the false light of superficial happiness. For the first time in years, Janet's default mode network, that background mental chatter, quieted into something approaching reverence. She wasn't just learning about a myth, she was remembering a pattern of transformation encoded in her neural architecture since birth. Sarah's therapist had diagnosed her with chronic anxiety, but Sarah knew it was something deeper. She felt like an orphan in her own life, surrounded by people who loved her, yet fundamentally alone, carrying a burden of existence that no one else seemed to understand. When she encountered the orphan archetype in Jungian psychology, something shifted at the neurochemical level. This wasn't about her childhood circumstances. Her parents had been loving and present. This was about her soul's archetypal journey, the particular pattern of initiation her psyche needed to undergo to discover its own source of inner authority. Research by Dr. Judson Brewer on the neuroscience of selflessness reveals that when people identify with archetypal patterns larger than their personal ego, their brains show decreased activity in the default mode network, the source of rumination and self-centered anxiety, and increased activity in networks associated with connection, meaning, and what he terms effortless awareness. The hero archetype activates neural circuits related to courage, forward movement, and the capacity to face challenges. When someone recognizes their hero pattern, their brain begins producing different combinations of neurotransmitters, less cortisol and adrenaline from chronic anxiety, more dopamine and norepinephrine associated with purposeful action. The lover archetype awakens neural networks connected to oxytocin production, mirror neuron activation, and the capacity for deep emotional resonance. People who embody their lover energy show increased connectivity between heart and brain rhythms, what heart math researchers call coherence. The healer archetype activates what neuroscientist Dr. Tanya Singer calls compassion circuits, neural networks that enable you to hold both suffering and healing simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed or detached. But here's what makes archetypal activation different from personality typing or psychological labeling. Archetypes are dynamic, living patterns that change your brain's relationship to challenge, connection, and purpose at the cellular level. When Sarah embraced her orphan journey, understanding that her feelings of existential aloneness were actually her psyche's way of preparing her to discover her own inner source of guidance, her chronic anxiety transformed into something she could only describe as sacred solitude. Her brain scans, taken months later, showed the neural signature not of someone who had overcome anxiety, but of someone who had integrated it into a larger pattern of spiritual maturation. There's a reason why certain stories make your skin tingle, why specific images bring tears to your eyes, before your mind understands why some mythic figures feel more real to you than your actual neighbors. Your body recognizes archetypal truth faster than your brain can process it, because archetypal patterns are encoded not just in neural tissue, but in what researchers are beginning to call cellular memory, information stored in the fascia, the heart, the gut's extensive nervous system. Michael had always felt like an imposter in corporate settings, despite his obvious competence. But when he encountered the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who transforms personal suffering into the capacity to help others, his entire physiology shifted. It wasn't just psychological insight, it was somatic recognition. His chronic shoulder tension, which he'd carried for years, began to release as he understood that his sensitivity, what he'd always seen as professional weakness, was actually his archetypal gift. His wounded places were not flaws to hide, but sources of healing wisdom to share. Dr. Candace Pert's research on the biochemistry of emotion showed that neuropeptides, the chemical messengers of emotion, are found throughout the body, not just in the brain. When archetypal recognition occurs, it triggers cascades of neuropeptide release that can restructure not just thoughts and feelings, but physical posture, breathing patterns, and even immune function. This is why mythic stories from thousands of years ago can still make your heart race or bring you to tears. Your cellular memory recognizes patterns of meaning that transcend personal experience, universal templates for transformation that your body knows even when your mind has forgotten. When someone encounters their authentic archetypal pattern, they often describe it as coming home to themselves. Neuroscientists call this self-referential processing, the brain's recognition of information that feels fundamentally true about who you are. But what they can't measure is the soul's sigh of relief when it finally finds a story large enough to contain its deepest truths. But knowing your archetypal pattern is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you begin to live it, when you create rituals that help your brain remember what your soul has always known. This is where ancient practices meet cutting-edge neuroscience and reveal that your ancestors knew something about changing the brain that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Ritual isn't superstition, it's the most sophisticated technology ever developed for rewiring neural patterns through embodied meaning. Emma had tried everything to heal from her mother's death: therapy, meditation apps, grief support groups, antidepressants. Her mind understood the stages of grief, could recite the psychology of loss, but her nervous system remained locked in a state of frozen protest, as if some part of her was still waiting by the phone for a call that would never come. It wasn't until she created a simple ritual that her healing truly began. Every morning, she would light a candle, speak aloud one memory of her mother, then blow out the flame while saying, "I carry you with me." No therapist had suggested this. No book had prescribed it. It arose from some deeper intelligence that knew her brain needed more than words to process such profound loss. What Emma didn't know was happening in her neural circuits. The combination of sensory input, the candle's warmth and scent, motor action, lighting and extinguishing, verbal expression, speaking the memory, and symbolic gesture, carrying love forward, was creating what neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Newberg calls neuroplastic integration the brain's ability to form new connections when multiple sensory and motor systems are engaged simultaneously. This is ritual's secret power. It gives the brain multiple entry points for processing experiences that are too big for rational thought alone. While talk therapy engages primarily the language centers of the brain, ritual activates a symphony of neural networks, sensory, motor, emotional, and symbolic, creating what researchers term embodied cognition. Dr. Matt Lieberman's research at UCLA shows that when we engage multiple brain systems simultaneously, our neural changes become more stable and lasting. But what his studies couldn't measure was the soul's recognition of being honored through physical gesture, of being included in the conversation between mind and body that had been fractured by trauma or loss. After 6 months of her morning ritual, Emma's grief hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. Instead of the frozen despair that had paralyzed her, she felt what she could only describe as activated love, a flowing connection to her mother that felt alive rather than lost. Her brain had learned to associate her mother's memory, not with abandonment, but with presence carried forward through conscious ritual. The most profound neural rewiring doesn't happen in dramatic moments of insight, but in the quiet accumulation of small, intentional acts that signal to your brain that you are someone worth caring for with sacred attention. David discovered this accidentally. After years of waking up to immediate phone checking, scrolling through news and emails before his feet touched the floor, he began a simple practice. Sitting on the edge of his bed for 30 seconds, placing both hands on his heart and asking, "What does my soul need today?" This wasn't meditation, it wasn't affirmations, it was what he later recognized as a ritual of reconnection, a daily moment of choosing his own internal guidance over the external world's immediate demands. What David couldn't see was how this 30-second practice was reshaping his default mode network. Instead of beginning each day with his brain's automatic scan for problems, threats, and obligations, he was training his neural circuitry to start from a place of self-attunement and inner listening. Dr. Richie Davidson's research on micro-practices shows that even brief moments of intentional attention can create measurable changes in brain structure when performed consistently. But what makes ritual different from simple habit is the element of symbolic meaning. The recognition that these small acts are not just behavioral changes, but sacred communications with the deeper self. Ritual works because it speaks the brain's oldest language, the language of symbol, gesture, and embodied meaning that predates rational thought by millions of years. When you create a ritual, you're not just changing your behavior, you're updating your brain's story about who you are and what you're worth. Sarah began ending each day by writing 3 lines in a journal. One thing she was grateful for, one thing she forgave herself for, and one thing she was curious about for tomorrow. This simple practice, performed for just 2 minutes before sleep, began rewiring her brain's default mode from rumination and self-criticism to appreciation, self-compassion, and forward-looking curiosity. Her neural scans, taken after 3 months of this practice, showed increased activity in the brain's self-compassion networks and decreased activity in regions associated with harsh self-judgment. But more importantly, Sarah reported feeling like she was having a different relationship with being human, less as a problem to be solved and more as a mystery to be explored with kindness. There's a secret hidden in plain sight within every therapy session, every meditation retreat, every self-help book. The most powerful tool for changing your brain has been available to you since childhood, but our rational culture taught you to dismiss it as just imagination. Carl Jung called it active imagination, the practice of dialoguing with the symbolic figures, landscapes, and narratives that arise spontaneously from the unconscious. Modern neuroscience has discovered that imagination activates the same neural networks as actual experience, creating what researchers call embodied simulation. your brain's inability to distinguish between vividly imagined and actually lived experience. When Lisa began practicing active imagination to work with her chronic anxiety, she encountered an inner figure she came to call the worried mother, a part of herself that had been scanning for danger since childhood, trying to keep everyone safe through hypervigilance. Instead of trying to eliminate this anxious part, Lisa began having imaginal conversations with her. She would visualize sitting with the worried mother in a comfortable room, listening to her concerns, acknowledging her protective intentions, and gradually helping her understand that the child she was protecting had grown into an adult capable of discernment. What was happening in Lisa's brain during these imaginal dialogues was profound. Her anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for integrating emotional and rational processing, showed increased activation. Her amygdala, the brain's alarm center, began to quiet. Most remarkably, her insula, the brain region that creates interoceptive awareness or the ability to sense internal states, became more active and coordinated. Through active imagination, Lisa wasn't just managing her anxiety, she was literally resculpting the neural networks that generated it. By treating her anxious part as a legitimate voice worthy of dialogue, rather than a symptom to be eliminated, she was creating what neuroscientist Dr. Dan Siegel calls neural integration, the capacity for different parts of the brain to work together harmoniously. This is ritual at its most sophisticated, the use of conscious imagination to heal splits within the psyche, to integrate disowned parts of the self, and to create new neural pathways of wholeness that honor rather than eliminate the complexity of human experience. 6 months later, Lisa's anxiety hadn't disappeared. It had been transformed into what she called embodied wisdom. Her nervous system had learned to distinguish between genuine intuitive warning and old trauma patterns. Her worried mother had evolved from a panicked guardian into a wise advisor who could offer useful information without hijacking her entire system. But there's something even more profound waiting for you. The moment when all these practices, all this neural rewiring, leads you back to the deepest truth of all, that your brain was always designed to be the servant of your soul, not its master. If this exploration of how ritual and imagination can literally rewire your brain resonates with something deep inside you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. What small ritual or imaginal practice has changed something in your neural landscape? Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. We've reached the place where science meets the sacred, where all the neural pathways and biochemical cascades point toward one inescapable truth. Your brain is not the author of your transformation. It's the translator of your soul's deepest intelligence into the language of lived experience. Margaret had been in therapy for 15 years, trying to heal what everyone called relationship patterns. She understood her attachment style, could trace her trust issues back to childhood wounds, had worked with trauma specialists and relationship coaches. Her rational mind held a PhD in her own dysfunction, but her heart remained locked behind walls that no amount of insight could penetrate. It wasn't until she began paying attention to her dreams that everything shifted. Night after night, she dreamed of trying to cross a frozen river, always stopping at the edge, afraid the ice wouldn't hold her weight. In traditional therapy, this might have been analyzed as fear of commitment or intimacy, but when Margaret began treating the dream as literal guidance from her psyche, something profound happened. She realized the frozen river represented her own emotional landscape, frozen not by fear of love, but by the terror of her own emotional power. Her psyche wasn't showing her a problem to be solved, but a threshold to be crossed with courage and reverence for her own depth. This is what neuroscience still struggles to measure. The soul's communication system operates through symbols, dreams, bodily sensations, and inexplicable knowings that bypass rational analysis entirely. When Margaret began honoring these symbolic messages, rather than trying to decode them intellectually, Her brain began changing in ways that 15 years of traditional therapy hadn't achieved. Dr. Arne Dietrich's research on the neuroscience of insight reveals that breakthrough moments, those aha experiences that create lasting change, involve a temporary reduction in prefrontal cortex activity, the rational mind, and a surge in right brain networks associated with pattern recognition and symbolic processing. True neuroplasticity happens not when you think your way into new patterns, but when you allow your soul's symbolic intelligence to guide the rewiring process. Your psyche knows exactly which neural pathways need to change and in what order, but it speaks in metaphors, not diagnostic manuals. Margaret's frozen river dream eventually led her to understand that her relationship patterns weren't pathology to be cured, but protection around a gift too precious to risk, her capacity for profound emotional attunement. Once she learned to cross that inner threshold with respect for her own sensitivity, her relationships began transforming not through effort, but through alignment with her authentic nature. The greatest lie ever told about personal transformation is that you need to become someone different than who you are. The brain, in its infinite wisdom, resists this lie at the cellular level, which is why most attempts at self-improvement feel like swimming upstream against your own neural current. But here's what mystics have always known, and neuroscience is beginning to confirm. You don't need to create a new self. You need to remove the obstacles to the self that has been pulsing within you since before you learned to doubt your own existence. When Carlos first began meditating, he approached it like everything else in his life, as a problem to be solved, a skill to be mastered, a way to fix what was wrong with his anxious, restless mind. For months he fought with his thoughts, judged his scattered attention and felt like a meditation failure. But something shifted the day he stopped trying to meditate and simply began listening to the rhythm of his own breathing as if it were poetry written by his soul. Instead of forcing his mind to be quiet, he began appreciating the complex symphony of his inner life, the thoughts, sensations, emotions, and deeper currents that flowed beneath conscious awareness. His brain scans showed what researchers call effortless awareness, a state where the default mode network quiets not through suppression, but through recognition of a deeper identity that includes but transcends the thinking mind. Carlos wasn't learning to meditate. He was remembering how to be present to the mystery of his own existence. This is the neuroscience of self-recognition. When you stop trying to improve yourself and begin investigating who you actually are beneath the stories you've been told about who you should be, your brain relaxes into patterns of curiosity, appreciation, and what contemplatives call beginner's mind. Dr. Judson Brewer's research on effortless awareness shows that the most profound neural changes occur not when people try to achieve specific meditative states, but when they develop what he calls metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe their own mental processes with curiosity rather than judgment. Self-knowledge isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a quality of attention you bring to the ongoing mystery of being human. And when you approach your own experience with the reverence of a scientist and the tenderness of a poet, your brain begins reorganizing itself around wonder rather than worry, presence rather than performance. There comes a moment in every genuine transformation when you realize that all the neural rewiring, all the psychological insights, all the spiritual practices were never about fixing what was broken. They were about remembering what was always whole. Elena spent decades believing her sensitivity was a weakness to be overcome. She trained her brain to be logical, rational, professionally competent. But despite her success, she felt like she was living someone else's life, wearing a neural costume that never quite fit. The integration began when she stopped trying to change her sensitivity and started honoring it as her soul's primary wisdom system. Her heightened emotional awareness wasn't pathology. It was her psyche's way of navigating a world that had forgotten how to feel its way towards truth. When Elena finally aligned her life with her authentic nature rather than fighting against it, her brain scans showed something researchers rarely see, a state of what they call whole brain coherence, where all neural networks work together in harmonious integration rather than competing for dominance. This is the ultimate goal of neuroplasticity, not to create a better brain, but to remove the obstacles that prevent your brain from serving your soul's deepest intelligence. When your neural patterns align with your authentic nature, thinking becomes an expression of wisdom rather than a protection against fear. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on integration shows that the healthiest brains are those that maintain both differentiation, the capacity for different neural networks to function uniquely, and linkage, the ability for those networks to communicate and coordinate. But what creates this integration isn't technical training. It's the soul's recognition of its own wholeness reflected through neural harmony. Elena's sensitivity, once seen as a weakness to be managed, became the very quality that allowed her to sense subtleties others missed, to feel into solutions that logic alone couldn't reach, to navigate relationships with an emotional intelligence that no amount of training could replicate. Her brain had finally found its true purpose, not to protect her from her own nature, but to express it with ever greater sophistication and grace. No change is real unless it is felt as memory in the body and as truth in the soul. This is the ultimate teaching that emerges when neuroscience meets the sacred. Your brain will only change in service of what your soul recognizes as authentic. You cannot think your way into being someone you're not, but you can remove the neural obstacles that prevent you from being who you've always been. The journey of self-knowledge is not about acquiring new information about yourself. It's about developing the courage to live from the truth that has been pulsing within you since before you learned to doubt your own existence. Your brain, in its infinite wisdom, has been waiting your entire life for this moment. When you finally stop trying to improve yourself and begin honoring the mystery of who you actually are. When that recognition becomes not just an idea but a lived reality, every neural pathway becomes a prayer, every thought becomes an offering, and every moment becomes an opportunity to express the sacred intelligence that was never separate from you. The brain doesn't create the soul, it serves it. And when that relationship is restored to its natural order, both neuroscience and spirituality reveal themselves as different languages describing the same fundamental truth. You are already whole, already wise, already home. You just needed to remember how to listen. If this journey through the sacred neuroscience of self-knowledge has touched something deep within you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated most deeply? What questions are arising for you now? And if you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to continue this conversation about the mysterious intersection where science meets soul. There's another video waiting for you that goes even deeper into these mysteries. Watch it next to continue this sacred inquiry into who you really are beneath all the stories you've been told about yourself.